What happens when one of the most scrutinized women in the world sits across from one of the sharpest interviewers on television, and the carefully constructed image she has spent years rebuilding starts to crack? Right there, under the studio lights, in front of millions of people watching at home. What happens when the questions do not stop, when the answers do not land the way they were supposed to, and when the room itself seems to turn? That is exactly what unfolded on Good Morning America, in what would become one of the most talked about morning television moments in recent memory. By the time it was over, Meghan Markle had walked off that set, and the clip was already burning through every corner of the internet. Before we get into every detail of what was said, what was not said, and the exact moment things fell apart, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling us whose side you are on, because this one is going to divide the room. Let us set the scene properly, because context matters here. Meghan Markle arriving on Good Morning America was not a quiet, low-stakes appearance. This was a woman who had, by her own telling, endured years of public mischaracterization, press hostility, and institutional silence. She had spoken openly, in high-profile settings, about the toll that scrutiny had taken on her. She had built a new life, a new brand, and a new platform designed, at least in part, to tell her story on her own terms. So when she agreed to sit down with Robin Roberts, someone known not for softball interviews but for thoughtful, probing, and often deeply personal conversations, the expectation was that this would be a moment of clarity, a chance to speak, to be heard, and to move the narrative forward. Robin Roberts, for her part, is not a journalist who plays games with her guests. She is not antagonistic in the tabloid sense. She does not raise her voice, she does not interrupt rudely, and she does not chase drama for the sake of ratings. What she does, consistently and with remarkable skill, is ask the question that is actually in the room, the one everyone watching at home is thinking but assumes will not be asked. That quality, that willingness to name the thing sitting right there between host and guest, is what makes her one of the best in the business. And it is also, as it turned out, on this particular morning, what made the interview so uncomfortable to watch. The opening exchanges were smooth. Meghan was warm, composed, and clearly prepared. She spoke about her projects with practiced enthusiasm, the kind of articulate passion that reads well on camera and invites the viewer in. Roberts matched her energy, asked generous questions, and the first few minutes had the easy rhythm of a conversation between two professionals who respected each other. The audience at home would have settled into their sofas, perhaps expecting something pleasant, perhaps expecting something a little deeper, but almost certainly not expecting what was coming. It was Roberts who shifted the tone first, and she did it with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about the exact right moment to do so. She smiled, leaned forward slightly, and asked Meghan directly about the public perception gap, the distance between how Meghan understood herself and her intentions, and how a very large portion of the public continued to see her. It was not an aggressive question, it was not laced with hostility, but it was honest in a way that the room could feel. Meghan's response came quickly, perhaps too quickly, and it had the quality of something rehearsed for a different version of the question. She spoke about being misunderstood, about the media's role in shaping narratives that bore little resemblance to reality, and about her desire to simply live authentically. These were not new themes. She had said versions of these things before, in other rooms, to other journalists. What was different here was Roberts' follow-up, because rather than nodding and moving on, she stayed in it. She pressed, gently but unmistakably, asking Meghan to speak to the specific criticisms that came not from tabloids or anonymous sources, but from people who had known her personally, people who had worked closely with her, and who had told their own stories that did not align with hers. The studio, which had been carrying the pleasant hum of a morning show in full swing, seemed to tighten. Meghan held her smile, but something shifted behind it. She answered, and her answer was careful, very careful. Careful in the way that things become when the person speaking is acutely aware of every word they are choosing. She spoke about the challenges of transition, about the difficulty of being human in an inhuman spotlight, and about her belief that most of the criticism directed at her was rooted in things that had nothing to do with who she actually was. Roberts listened, let the answer finish, and then did the thing that truly changed the temperature of the room. She cited a specific account, not vaguely, not obliquely, but directly. She named the nature of an allegation, drawn from testimony given by someone from within the royal household, about an incident involving a member of staff. She did not sensationalize it, she simply asked Meghan, plainly and without drama, to respond to it. And the way Meghan responded to that question is the reason this interview became what it became. There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough to notice, long enough to feel. Meghan looked at Roberts with an expression that moved through several things very quickly. And then she said that she found it disappointing that a platform like Good Morning America would choose to amplify what she characterized as a deeply one-sided and already addressed narrative. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge under it now. The kind of edge that comes when something genuinely unexpected has happened and the usual mechanisms for managing it are not quite working. Roberts did not back down. She acknowledged Meghan's feelings about the framing, validated them briefly and sincerely, and then said, with the calm of someone who had been in difficult rooms before, that she was asking because the audience deserved the chance to hear Meghan's perspective on it directly, rather than having it exist only in the space of other people's accounts. It was, by any measure, a fair and reasonable position. And it was also, for Meghan, clearly not the conversation she had come prepared to have. What followed was a sequence of exchanges that escalated gradually but unmistakably. Meghan began to respond with more energy, more force, and less of the careful calibration that had characterized her answers up to that point. She talked about accountability, about the responsibility of journalists to consider the harm that certain lines of questioning could cause, and about her own mental health, invoking it not as a deflection but as a genuine reference point for why some of this was difficult. Roberts, to her credit, engaged with every point. She did not dismiss the mental health dimension. She did not wave away the media criticism. But she also did not abandon the question. She came back to it, threading it through the conversation with patience and intent, and asked Meghan whether there was any version of the specific allegation that she was willing to address in concrete terms, rather than in the abstract language of narrative and perception. In this, more than anything else in the first stretch of the interview, was the moment where the viewer at home could see the shift happening in real time. Because Meghan's answer, when it came, did not answer the question. It answered a different question, a question about how she felt about being asked, rather than about what she thought about what had been alleged. Roberts noticed this. She let the answer play out, waited for it to reach its natural end, and then asked it again, reworded but unmistakably, the same question. And the look that crossed Meghan's face in that moment, the very brief, very controlled flash of something that might have been frustration or might have been something closer to alarm, is what people replayed over and over again once the footage started circulating. It was a human moment, it was real, and it was the beginning of the end of this interview's carefully managed surface. If you are watching right now, and you can already feel this going somewhere uncomfortable, you are right. Stay with us, because the second part of this conversation is where things truly unraveled. And what Robin Roberts said next is something nobody in that studio was fully prepared for. That repeated question, the one Roberts had now asked twice in slightly different forms, hung in the air of that studio in a way that was almost physical. Meghan had just been caught in the conversational equivalent of a slow closing door, and the audience watching at home could feel the pressure of it. What came next defined the entire middle section of this interview, and it is the part that most people, even those who had followed Meghan's public journey closely, were not expecting. Meghan leaned forward and said, very deliberately, that she thought it was important to name what was actually happening in this line of questioning. She said that she had come to Good Morning America in good faith, to talk about her work, her vision, and the things she genuinely cared about, and that she felt the interview had been redirected toward a set of narratives that she believed were designed not to illuminate but to diminish. She said this without raising her voice. She said it with composure, but she said it with a directness that shifted the energy in the room in a way that even the cameras seemed to register. Roberts received this without flinching. She nodded, and when Meghan finished, she said something that was remarkably simple and remarkably effective. She said that she understood Meghan felt that way, and that she respected it, and that she wanted to ask one more time, not to diminish her, but because the people who had raised these concerns were real people, whose accounts also existed and also deserved space in the conversation. She then asked, for the third time, whether Meghan had anything she wanted to say directly about the staph allegations that had emerged during the period of her time within the royal family. This was the moment. This was the precise moment that the interview cracked open, because Meghan, who had been measured and controlled through everything up to this point, looked at Roberts with an expression that was no longer performing composure. She said that she was not going to sit on national television and legitimize what she described as a coordinated campaign of reputational damage by engaging with specific claims that she had already addressed through the appropriate channels. She said that doing so would only serve the people whose interest it was to keep the story alive. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it now that was unmistakably personal, unmistakably raw, and unmistakably close to the edge. Roberts, rather than pulling back, did what the very best interviewers do in exactly this kind of moment. She paused. She let the silence exist. And then she said, quietly, that she just wanted to make sure she understood, and asked whether Meghan was saying that she had nothing to add to those accounts. Meghan said yes. That was what she was saying. And Roberts said, still quietly, still without hostility, that she thought the audience would find that answer interesting, given that Meghan had previously spoken at length in other forums about the importance of being heard and of not allowing other people's versions of events to go unchallenged. The implication was precise, and it landed exactly the way Roberts intended it to. Meghan had, in multiple high-profile interviews over the years, made the case that silence in the face of falsehood was its own kind of harm. She had said, in those settings, that she was not willing to let narratives stand that she knew to be untrue. And now, in this studio, faced with a direct opportunity to challenge a specific account, she was choosing not to. Roberts was not accusing her of hypocrisy. She was simply holding up a mirror. And the reflection was uncomfortable. Meghan's response to this was longer than her previous ones, and in its length it revealed more than a shorter answer might have. She spoke about context, about the difference between choosing your moment and being forced into someone else's framing. She talked about the way certain questions, no matter how they were phrased, functioned as traps rather than invitations. She said that the media's appetite for conflict around her specifically was something she had learned to recognize and to refuse to feed. She said that she was trying to model something different, a different way of engaging with public life. One that was not defined by the cycle of accusation and rebuttal. It was a coherent argument. There was logic to it. But it was also, and this was the thing, that viewers could not stop talking about. A way of answering that kept rotating around the question without ever touching it. Roberts sat with this answer for a beat, and then said something that is now one of the most quoted lines from the entire interview. She said, gently, but with absolute precision, that she heard all of that. And she wondered whether there was a version of it that was not also simply about not answering. The studio went very quiet, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the way that spaces go quiet when something true has been said. Meghan looked at Roberts. Roberts looked at Meghan, and the audience watching at home held their breath in a way that morning television very rarely produces. What Meghan said next was telling, not because of what it contained, but because of what it reached for. She said she thought it was incredibly unfair to characterize her considered decision about how to engage with disinformation as avoidance. She said the framing itself was part of the problem. She said that if she answered, she would be accused of being defensive, and if she did not answer, she would be accused of hiding something, and that this was the impossible position she had been placed in from the beginning. She said it was exhausting, and for a moment, the exhaustion in her voice was the most genuine thing that had been in the room since the interview began. Roberts met that moment with something that was neither cold nor warm, but precise. She said she understood the bind. She really did. And then she asked whether the exhaustion Meghan was describing was something she had considered when deciding to do this interview. Given that it was always going to involve these questions, it was not unkind. It was not a trap. It was simply the obvious thing to ask. And the fact that it landed as hard as it did said everything about how little distance there was between Meghan's stated position and the reality of the room she was sitting in. The conversation shifted again at this point, and not in the direction anyone watching might have predicted. Rather than pulling the temperature down, Meghan leaned into it. She began to talk about the specific experience of being a black woman in a historically white institution, about the ways in which her behavior had been coded and interpreted through a lens that would not have been applied to others. She said that some of the criticism she received, including the staff allegations, needed to be understood within that context, and that stripping that context away was itself a form of misrepresentation. This was a genuinely powerful argument, and Roberts engaged with it seriously. She said she took that point very much on board, and that she thought it was an important part of the conversation. And then she said that she wanted to ask Meghan, directly and in that spirit, whether she believed the staff members who had raised concerns were themselves acting out of racial bias, or whether there were other explanations she would point to. It was a question that took Meghan's own framing and pushed it to its logical conclusion. It was the kind of question that demanded a specific answer. Meghan paused again. Longer this time. She said she was not going to speak for other people's motivations. She said she could only speak to her own experience and her own truth. Roberts said she understood, and asked whether Meghan could speak to what that experience and that truth looked like in relation to those specific incidents. Meghan said that she had done that in other places, and that she was not going to repeat it here in a format that she felt was not set up to honor it. Roberts asked what format would honor it. Meghan said that was a very good question. And the way she said it, the slight brittleness in the delivery, told you that she did not have an answer she was ready to give. It was around this point that the interview began to feel less like a conversation and more like a standoff. Not a hostile one, not a dramatic one, but a genuine, unresolvable standoff between two people who were both being entirely themselves. Roberts was not going to stop asking the question. Meghan was not going to answer it, and the space between those two positions had become the actual subject of the interview. More interesting, more revealing, and more uncomfortable than any direct answer might have been. What happened in the final stretch of this conversation is something we are going to walk through in complete detail, because the ending is not what you think it is, and the moment Meghan finally stood up is one that needs to be understood properly. Keep watching. The standoff that had been building across the entire conversation was now the only thing in the room. Every other subject, every earlier exchange about projects and purpose and platform, had receded entirely. What remained was this. Two women sitting across from each other, One unwilling to move off the question, one unwilling to answer it, in an audience of millions watching. The silence between them stretched in a way that no producer had planned for, and no amount of preparation could have prevented. Roberts broke the silence by doing something unexpected. Rather than asking the question again, she changed her approach entirely. She said she wanted to try something different, and she asked Meghan, not about the allegations specifically, but about the version of herself that she wanted the public to know. She asked Meghan, sincerely and without any edge, what she felt people consistently got wrong about who she was as a person, separate from the institutions and the controversies and the public record. It was an opening, a genuine one, an invitation to step out of the defensive posture and say something real. Meghan took a breath, and for a moment, watching her, you could see her deciding something. She said that what people consistently got wrong was that she was calculating. She said that the narrative of her, as someone who planned and maneuvered and orchestrated her own image, was one of the most painful misrepresentations she had lived with. Because the truth, as she experienced it, was that she had spent most of her public life reacting to things that happened to her rather than engineering them. She said she was someone who led with feeling, sometimes to her own detriment, and that the version of her that existed in certain parts of the press and in certain corners of public opinion bore no resemblance to the woman she knew herself to be. It was the most unguarded thing she had said in the entire interview. Roberts recognized it as such. She nodded, and said that she appreciated that, and that she believed Meghan meant it. And then, having let that moment breathe for exactly the right amount of time, she said that she wanted to bring that answer back to what they had been discussing. Because if Meghan was someone who led with feeling rather than calculation, she was curious what the feeling had been in the specific moments that had led to the staff complaints. Not the narrative, not the context, but the feeling in those rooms. It was the most elegant pivot Roberts had made in the entire interview, and it was devastating in its simplicity. She had used Meghan's own self-description to open a door that every previous question had failed to open, and she had done it without any visible strategy, just with the unhurried intelligence of someone who had been listening very carefully the whole time. The studio felt it. You could feel it through the screen. Meghan looked at Roberts for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, that she thought Robin was very good at her job. Roberts said thank you, and waited. Meghan said that she was not going to answer that, and that she wanted to be honest about why. She said the reason was not what people would assume. It was not legal. It was not political. It was personal. She said there were things that had happened that she had not fully processed. Even now, and that's speaking about the feelings inside those specific moments, publicly, on a morning show, was something she was not in a position to do without, it costing her something she was not prepared to spend. She said she hoped Roberts could understand that. It was, in its own way, the most honest answer she had given, not because it revealed what people wanted to know, but because it admitted something true about the limits of what she was willing to give in that space. Roberts sat with it. She did not challenge it. She said she understood, and that she respected it. And then she said that she had one final question, and she hoped Meghan would stay with her for it. She asked Meghan whether, looking at the trajectory of everything, the departure from royal life, the interviews, the documentary, the book, the public statements and whether there was anything she would have done differently, not in terms of the decisions themselves, but in terms of how she had communicated them. Whether there were moments where she felt, in retrospect, that the way something was said had made things harder rather than easier, for herself, for others, for the possibility of any kind of resolution. The question was not a trap. It was almost the opposite of a trap. It was an invitation to show growth, to show self-awareness, to show the kind of reflection that the public had been waiting years to see from her. And the way Meghan answered it is the reason this interview ended the way it did. She said no. She said that every decision she had been made with integrity, with intention, and with the well-being of her family as the central concern, and that she was not going to perform regret for the comfort of people who had never been in her position. She said that asking a woman who had been through what she had been through whether she would have communicated it differently was, in itself, a reflection of a broader cultural tendency to ask the person who had been harmed to account for the way they chose to survive. She said she found the question, with respect, and she emphasized the words with respect, to be rooted in a premise she fundamentally rejected. Roberts did not respond immediately. She looked at Meghan with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read, and then she said, in a tone that was neither warm nor cold but simply precise, that she wanted to push back on one part of that, gently. She said that the question had not been about whether Meghan should have stayed silent or been less honest. It had been about craft and communication, about whether any of the choices in how things were said had, in Meghan's own view, contributed to the difficulty. She said she asked it of everyone who had been through large public experiences, and that she did not think answering it honestly required anyone to diminish what they had endured. Meghan said that she had heard the question, and that her answer was still no. Roberts said, simply, that she appreciated the clarity. And then there was a pause that was longer than any previous pause in the interview. Not awkward, not dramatic, but full, the way a pause gets full when both people in a conversation have said what they came to say, and neither of them is quite ready to call it. Then Meghan reached forward, placed her hand briefly on the table between them, and said that she had appreciated the opportunity to be here, that she thought Robin was formidable, and that she thought they were done. Robert said she thought so too. Meghan stood, she thanked the crew, she was measured about it, gracious even, but the movement was definitive. She was leaving, not in the middle of a sentence, not in tears, not in a visible rage, but leaving nonetheless, and leaving on her own terms, which was itself a kind of statement. The cameras caught it all. The moment she arose, the moment the interview ended, not with a sign-off, but with a departure. The moment Robert sat alone at the desk for just a beat longer than the edit would normally allow. It was television that nobody had scripted, and it was more revealing than anything that had been said in the preceding 40 minutes. Because it told you exactly where the line was. Not the line between truth and lie, not the line between guilt and innocence, but the line between what Meghan Markle would give and what she would not, and what it looked like when someone finally reached it. What do you make of all of that? Depends entirely on what you brought into the room with you. If you came in believing that Meghan has been consistently wronged and unfairly pursued, you likely saw a woman holding a boundary under sustained and unreasonable pressure. If you came in with doubts about her consistency or her candor, you likely saw someone refuse a reasonable question for the fourth time and frame that refusal as principle. The interview did not settle anything. It was never going to settle anything. What it did was show you, with unusual clarity, who both of these women are when the performance has nowhere left to go. That is the thing about a real interview. A genuinely good one, it does not give you answers. It gives you a much clearer picture of the questions, and the question at the center of everything that happened on that set, the one that Roberts kept returning to and Meghan kept refusing, is still unanswered. Maybe it always will be. Maybe that is the point. If this video kept you watching all the way to the end, hit subscribe because we cover moments like this in the depth they deserve, and we want to know what you think, so leave a comment below answering this. Do you think Meghan walking off was a power move or a mistake? Let us know.